Hey guys, tonight let's do something a little different. Dim the lights, put your phone face down, get comfortable in whatever position your spine will regret tomorrow. Because tonight, we're drifting gently away from medieval castles and damp European palaces and floating instead into a very modern kingdom. A kingdom of fluorescent lighting, bad coffee, and framed diplomas covering every available wall. This is the story of Cheryl Richardson. She is not a queen, she did not wear a crown, but she did rule something far more terrifying, a hospital boardroom. And like all good dynastic tragedies, this one begins with a family legacy that absolutely refused to mind its own business. Cheryl was born into medicine the way some people are born into vineyards or horse racing. It was just there, in the air, in the furniture, in the conversation, whether you asked for it or not. Her father, Dr. James Richardson, was a respected internist, the kind of doctor whose name carried weight in the community, the kind of man who shook hands slowly and confidently because he knew everyone already knew who he was. Her mother, Dr. Margaret Richardson, was a leading gynecologist, efficient, highly accomplished, not especially warm, but very proud of herself. And honestly, she had the resume to justify it. Between the two of them, medicine wasn't just a profession, it was a personality trait. Their home reflected this completely. Walls lined with degrees, anatomical charts framed like fine art, bookshelves that groaned under the weight of medical journals no one had touched since the Clinton administration. Other kids grew up with posters of bands or movie stars. Cheryl grew up with cross-sections of kidneys. Family dinners were not about feelings, they were about cases, about patients who didn't listen, about insurance companies, which were discussed with the kind of venom usually reserved for ancient enemies. And from the very beginning, there was a plan. Cheryl had an older brother, Thomas, golden child Thomas. Thomas loved medicine, or at least he loved the version of medicine his parents loved. White coat, private practice, prestige. He fit into the Richardson mold the way it had been designed for him specifically, and their parents adored him for it. Cheryl, meanwhile, was fine. Not bad, not rebellious, just slightly off script. She liked medicine, she really did, but not the hands-on, blood and bones side of it. What fascinated her were systems, processes, why one hospital worked smoothly and another felt like it was held together by duct tape and silent resentment. In high school, while Thomas was shadowing doctors and memorizing terminology, Cheryl worked the front desk at the family practice, scheduling appointments, managing paperwork, watching how everything actually functioned behind the scenes. And she noticed things. Patients waiting too long, charts getting lost, billing errors that created chaos weeks later. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. One day, almost by accident, Cheryl shadowed a hospital administrator. Not a doctor, not a surgeon, just someone who understood the whole machine worked. And something clicked. This, she realized, was where real change happened, not in individual exam rooms, but in the systems that shaped every patient's experience. She was still young enough to think this realization would be welcomed. So, naturally, she was wrong. Her parents had already decided her future. Pre-med, medical school, white coat. End of discussion. And Cheryl, wanting peace more than conflict, went along with it. She enrolled in pre-med, at her father's alma mater, of course, because tradition is very important when you're living someone else's life. For a while, she tried to convince herself this was fine, that the discomfort was just nerves, that everyone probably felt this way. But by junior year, the truth was impossible to ignore. She didn't want to be a physician. She wanted to run healthcare systems. So she did the unthinkable. She told her parents. It happened at a family dinner, which was unfortunate, because Richardson family dinners were already tense on a good day. Cheryl explained calmly that she wanted to switch her focus to healthcare administration, management, business, leadership. Her parents heard something very different. They heard betrayal. Her father accused her of lacking discipline, of taking the easy way out, which is always an interesting accusation when directed at someone choosing a demanding competitive field with no guaranteed prestige. Her mother was colder, sharper. She dismissed healthcare administration as a glorified secretary role, a phrase that landed exactly as cruelly as intended. And then came the punishment. Financial support was cut off immediately. No discussion, no grace period. If Cheryl wanted this path, she would walk it alone. Communication with her parents dwindled to polite, strained fragments. Thomas, loyal to the family narrative, sided with them. And just like that, Cheryl became the black sheep. Not because she failed, but because she chose differently. It was not a dramatic estrangement, no shouting matches every week, no slammed doors, just silence, which somehow was worse. Cheryl adjusted. She changed her major to healthcare administration, added a business administration concentration, worked multiple jobs, took out loans, and something surprising happened. She thrived. Her grades improved, her confidence grew. She wasn't just surviving, she was excelling. Along the way, she met Dr. Eleanor Winters, a healthcare executive who recognized immediately what her parents had missed: talent. Under Dr. Winters' mentorship, Cheryl landed a competitive hospital internship, and during that internship, she led a quality improvement project that reduced emergency room wait times by 22%. Not by yelling at staff, not by working people to exhaustion, but by redesigning systems. It was quiet success, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but changes lives. From there, Cheryl earned 2 master's degrees, healthcare administration and an MBA. Top of her class, multiple job offers. She accepted a 2-year administrative fellowship at Memorial Hospital, a place she would come to know extremely well. She rotated through departments, observed everything, asked questions others didn't bother with, and then she started fixing things. Her redesign of the outpatient scheduling system reduced no-shows by 30%, increased revenue by over $2 million. People noticed. After the fellowship, she became Director of Outpatient Services, then Associate Chief Operating Officer by 30. Then, at 33, the youngest Chief Operating Officer in the hospital's history. Older physicians resisted her at first. Of course they did. She was young, she wasn't a traditional clinician, and she had data. But data has a way of winning arguments, slowly, relentlessly. Cheryl led with evidence, with respect, with an understanding of clinical realities that many administrators lacked, and one by one she earned trust. During all of this, contact with her family remained minimal. They knew she had a career. They assumed it was fine. They did not ask questions. Then, at 36, the CEO of Memorial Hospital retired. Cheryl was encouraged to apply. She did. After a grueling interview process, she became both CEO and CMO. At 38. And somewhere quietly, fate cleared its throat, because during a strategic planning meeting, a familiar name appeared on a list of potential acquisitions: Richardson Family Medicine. Her parents' practice. It had an excellent reputation, a loyal patient base, and deeply outdated operations. Financial management was poor, market share was declining, electronic health records had never been updated, patient satisfaction scores were slipping. Legacy, it turned out, does not pay bills. Cheryl faced a choice: recuse herself or oversee the process professionally. She chose oversight, with transparency, with checks, with boundaries. Due diligence revealed deeper problems than expected. The acquisition committee recommended proceeding, and Cheryl approved it. Not out of revenge, but because it made sense. She requested to lead the integration personally, which meant, eventually, sitting across a conference table from the people who once told her she wasn't good enough. But that meeting comes later. For now, let's just sit with this moment, a quiet one, a fluorescent-lit pause in the story, where a girl once dismissed as a disappointment had slowly and methodically become exactly what her family legacy needed, and didn't even realize it yet. Let's float gently forward from here. So let's ease back in. Same soft lighting, same slow breathing, same faint hum of institutional air conditioning in the background. When we last drifted off, Cheryl Richardson was sitting in her office at Memorial Hospital. CEO, CMO, 2 titles, 1 very full calendar. And somewhere on her desk, probably under a stack of reports she'd actually read, was a file with a name she hadn't said out loud in years. Richardson Family Medicine, her parents' practice, the place where she'd once answered phones as a teenager, the place where the walls still held decades-old certificates like protective talismans, the place that believed legacy could substitute for modernization forever. It turns out it could not. The numbers were not kind, not catastrophic, just quietly bad, which is always worse. The practice still had an excellent reputation. Patients trusted the name. Older families stayed loyal out of habit and gratitude, but younger patients were drifting away, choosing practices with online scheduling, electronic records, text reminders, all the boring things that actually matter. Overhead costs were high, billing was inefficient, equipment purchases had been optimistic, and the compensation model heavily favored senior physicians, which meant younger associates came in, stayed briefly, and left politely. A slow leak. Cheryl reviewed the data the way she reviewed everything else, carefully, without sentiment, and occasionally with a long exhale. She considered recusing herself entirely. It would have been cleaner emotionally, but also riskier professionally. So instead, she stayed involved, with oversight, with transparency, with other executives watching closely. The due diligence process went forward, and as it did, the truth became impossible to ignore. Richardson Family Medicine needed help, real help, not cosmetic changes, not another framed award in the hallway. The acquisition committee recommended moving forward. Cheryl approved it. Somewhere between the approval and the first scheduled meeting, she allowed herself exactly 1 moment of feeling something. Not anger, not triumph, just a quiet, complicated sadness. Because no matter how prepared she was professionally, this was still her family, and families have a way of turning boardroom decisions into emotional archaeology. The meeting was scheduled as a standard negotiation session, neutral ground, conference room, water bottles no one would drink. Cheryl did not announce her involvement ahead of time, not as a trick, not as a reveal, just because it wasn't relevant until it was. Her parents arrived first. James Richardson looked older than she remembered, still upright, still composed, but the sharpness had softened. Margaret Richardson was unchanged, perfect posture, controlled expression, eyes that missed nothing. Thomas came with them, white coat, professional, a little tense. They greeted the Memorial Hospital representatives politely, confidently. They did not recognize Cheryl at first, which is understandable. People don't expect their disappointments to show up in charge. When she entered the room, there was a pause, just a beat too long to be accidental. Then confusion, then recognition, and then silence. Cheryl introduced herself calmly. Name, title, Chief Executive Officer, Chief Medical Officer, Memorial Hospital. Her father blinked. Once, twice. Her mother's lips pressed together, the way they did when she was recalculating something internally. Thomas just stared. No one spoke. Eventually, Cheryl filled the space. She thanked them for coming, outlined the agenda, kept her voice steady. This was not a family meeting, this was a business one. The presentation began. Data appeared on the screen: revenue trends, patient satisfaction scores, operational inefficiencies. Her parents pushed back immediately. They spoke of reputation, of decades of service, of loyalty. Cheryl listened, then gently redirected. Reputation doesn't fix billing delays. Loyalty doesn't modernize records. History does not automatically translate into sustainability. Her father grew defensive. Her mother grew sharper. Thomas stayed quiet. Cheryl presented the acquisition offer: fair, firm, respectful. Retention of the practice name, transitional leadership roles, resources for modernization. It was, objectively, generous. Her father countered with something else entirely. He proposed that Cheryl buy into the practice instead, a partial ownership stake, 20%. She could join them, help modernize, but clinical control would remain with him. It was framed as reconciliation, but it felt like leverage. Cheryl paused, and then she did something she hadn't planned to do at all. She told the truth. She explained that Memorial Hospital already owned the practice, that the agreement had been signed, that this meeting was about integration, not negotiation. She placed the document on the table. No drama, no raised voice, just paper. The room changed. Her father stood abruptly, muttered something under his breath, left. Margaret stayed seated, her expression unreadable. Thomas finally spoke. He asked questions, quiet ones, practical ones. After the meeting ended, Thomas caught up with Cheryl in the hallway. They talked, not as executives, not as adversaries, as siblings. He admitted he hadn't understood her path, that he assumed she'd taken something easier. Cheryl didn't argue. She explained what she did, why it mattered. Thomas listened. The next day, their parents requested another meeting. This one was different. Less posturing, more realism. Cheryl held firm boundaries. No retribution, no special treatment, just what the practice needed to survive. They agreed on a transition plan. James and Margaret would remain for 2 years, gradually reducing patient loads. Thomas would stay on and begin learning administrative skills. Margaret invited Cheryl to dinner, tentatively. Cheryl declined, not out of spite, but honesty. Some things take time. Over the following months, Cheryl became a familiar presence at the practice, not as a conqueror, but as a collaborator. Renovations began, systems updated, workflows redesigned. Some staff were skeptical, most were relieved. Patient satisfaction improved, gradually, then noticeably. James Richardson resisted at first, then softened. Margaret found a new role in community outreach, something she was surprisingly good at. Thomas and Cheryl worked together. Clinical meets administrative, old school meets data. It wasn't perfect. Some tensions lingered, some conversations remained careful, but something fundamental had shifted. At a public open house celebrating the practice's renewal, James Richardson spoke, briefly. He talked about evolution, about medicine changing, about the importance of adaptation. He did not say Cheryl's name, but everyone knew. Later, privately, Margaret told Cheryl she was proud of her, quietly, without ceremony, which, coming from her, was enormous. Cheryl reflected on the journey often, on how rejection had propelled her, on how legacy almost collapsed under its own weight, and on defining success for herself had ultimately saved something much bigger. She continued balancing her role as hospital CEO with involvement in the practice, expanding services, integrating education, bridging worlds. And sometimes, late at night, she thought about that younger version of herself, the one sitting at a family dinner table, trying to explain a dream no one wanted to hear. She wished she could tell her something, not that it would be easy, not that it would be fair, just that it would be worth it. And with that gentle thought, we can let the story settle. No fireworks, no final confrontation, just a long, quiet recalibration, the kind that lasts. And as you drift off, maybe consider this one soft truth. Sometimes the path that disappoints everyone else is the one that finally lets you breathe. We'll stay here a little longer next time. All right, welcome back. Same low volume, same unhurried pace. Nothing sudden is going to happen, I promise. By now, the acquisition was complete. The paperwork had been filed, the systems were being updated. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent to everyone's emotional growth. And this is usually the part of stories where things end, neatly, with the lesson, with closure. But real life, as usual, preferred something slower and messier. Because once the shock wore off, once the hierarchy had flipped and everyone had gone home to quietly rethink their assumptions, there was still the daily reality of working together. And that took time. Cheryl didn't swoop in and redesign everything overnight. She didn't replace staff. She didn't strip the walls of their decades of framed credentials. She listened first. She spent long hours walking through the practice, talking to nurses, office managers, billing staff who had been quietly compensating for broken systems for years. They were tired, not dramatic tired, just the deep professional fatigue of people who cared but hadn't been given the tools to succeed. Cheryl took notes, lots of them, and slowly, carefully, changes began. Electronic health records were introduced, not all at once, not with unrealistic deadlines, but in phases. Training sessions were held, questions were encouraged, frustrations were expected. James Richardson hated it at first. He didn't say so directly, he never did, but he sighed a lot, asked pointed questions, reminded everyone that the old system worked just fine, which, statistically speaking, it hadn't. Margaret approached things differently. She watched, observed outcomes, noticed that patient wait times dropped, that complaints decreased. She didn't apologize, she didn't reflect aloud, she simply adapted. Thomas surprised everyone. Once freed from the pressure of being the sole bearer of the family legacy, he relaxed. He asked Cheryl questions, real ones, about operations, about budgets, about why certain decisions were made. He wasn't bad at it. In fact, he was good. The sibling dynamic shifted, not dramatically, not with hugs and declarations, but with mutual respect. They became colleagues, and in the background, something else was happening. Word spread. Patients noticed improvements. Younger families returned. Online reviews improved. The practice stabilized. James Richardson noticed too. One afternoon, months into the transition, he asked Cheryl a question. Not about systems, not about metrics. He asked if she ever regretted not becoming a doctor. Cheryl paused, then answered honestly, "No." He nodded. That was it. For him, that was as close as it got to an apology. At Memorial Hospital, Cheryl's role continued to expand. She balanced institutional leadership with personal history more gracefully than she had expected. She spoke at conferences, mentored younger administrators. Occasionally, she recommended someone for a role based not on pedigree, but potential, which felt important. Her parents remained complicated. Margaret began inviting Cheryl to family dinners again, infrequently, carefully. Cheryl accepted some, declined others. Boundaries once learned are hard to unlearn. James became something unexpected, a quiet advocate. He mentioned Cheryl to colleagues, suggested her as a mentor, referred students interested in healthcare administration. He never said he'd been wrong, but he acted as if he'd learned, which, for him, was everything. Cheryl reflected often on how strange it all was, that the thing her parents had dismissed had ended up saving their legacy, that her rejection had forced her to build something independent, and that independence had given her the authority to help without needing permission. She thought about the irony, about how systems matter more than symbols, about how prestige fades faster than relevance. And sometimes, late at night, she thought about all the people quietly struggling under expectations that didn't fit, the kids following paths chosen for them, the professionals staying silent to keep peace. She hoped they'd find their way too, not with dramatic confrontations, not with revenge, but with patience, with competence, with quiet confidence. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is succeed calmly, and eventually, people notice. As Cheryl continued her work, the story stopped being about proving anyone wrong. It became about building something sustainable, something modern, something humane, which is less exciting, but far more meaningful. And as this story settles into stillness, as the lights dim and the systems hum along smoothly, we can leave Cheryl where she belongs, not triumphant, not vindicated, just grounded, at ease in the life she chose. And if you're still awake, drifting somewhere between thoughts, maybe let this one linger. You don't have to follow the script you were handed, and you don't have to burn it down either. Sometimes all you need to do is write your own, quietly, and let time do the rest. We'll stop here for tonight. Just the slow continuation of a life that no longer needs to prove anything. By the time a year had passed since the acquisition, the chaos had fully evaporated. Not disappeared dramatically, just thinned out, like fog that forgets why it showed up in the first place. Richardson Family Medicine no longer felt frozen in time. The waiting room still had the same chairs, the same faint smell of disinfectant and old magazines, but the flow was different. Appointments ran on time, records were accessible, staff didn't whisper complaints in hallways anymore, which, in healthcare, is a small miracle. Cheryl didn't visit as often now. She didn't need to. That, she realized, was the real sign of success. Systems that work don't require constant supervision. They just function. James Richardson had adjusted in his own way. He still came in early, still wore the same white coat, still preferred paper notes for personal reference, even though everything was digital now. But he stopped resisting. He no longer questioned every update, no longer sighed during meetings. Instead, he asked quieter questions, clarifying ones. Margaret, meanwhile, had found her niche. Community outreach became her project. Free screenings, educational talks, partnerships with local schools. She thrived there. It gave her something the private practice never fully had: visibility, impact, control, but without the daily grind. Cheryl watched this evolution with mild surprise. Not everyone wants to admit they needed a different role. Margaret simply stepped into one. Thomas grew the most. Without the weight of being the obvious successor, he experimented. He took leadership workshops, learned the financial side of the practice. He became a bridge between clinicians and administrators, between old culture and new systems. Cheryl trusted him, which was new. They didn't talk about the past much. They didn't need to. Some things resolve not through discussion, but through changed behavior. At Memorial Hospital, Cheryl's reputation solidified. She wasn't flashy. She didn't chase headlines. She was known for stability, for making decisions that aged well. Younger administrators sought her out, asked how she'd navigated resistance, how she'd balanced empathy with authority. She gave honest answers, that it takes time, that people fear losing relevance more than they fear change itself, that data helps, but patience matters more. Occasionally, someone asked about her family. She kept it simple. "We work together now," which was true. The strangest part, Cheryl thought, was how little she cared about validation anymore. The hunger for approval had faded, not because she finally received it, but because she'd built something sturdy enough without it. She noticed this one evening at a hospital event. Her parents were there, standing nearby, watching her speak with board members. James looked proud, Margaret looked thoughtful, and Cheryl felt neutral. Not cold, not distant, just complete, which is a quiet kind of freedom. Time continued its steady work. James began reducing his hours, then his days. Retirement loomed, not as a crisis, but as a transition. He didn't make a speech about it. He never would. He simply started mentoring younger physicians more intentionally, passing on knowledge without clinging to authority. Margaret talked about writing, about documenting her experiences, about leaving something behind that wasn't a practice, but a perspective. Cheryl encouraged her, genuinely. They still weren't close in the traditional sense, but they were respectful. That counted. Every now and then, Cheryl thought back to that first family dinner, the one where everything broke. She remembered how small she'd felt, how uncertain, and she marveled at how far that version of herself had traveled without ever becoming loud. That's the thing no one tells you. You don't have to announce your growth. You don't have to demand recognition. If you build something real, eventually people stand inside it whether they acknowledge you or not. Cheryl's life settled into a rhythm. Work, mentorship, occasional dinners with family, long walks when she needed to think. She didn't rush into relationships. She didn't feel behind. She trusted her pacing now, and that might have been the biggest victory of all. As years passed, Richardson family medicine stopped being talked about as the old prestigious practice. It became the one that adapted, which is a much better reputation. James eventually retired fully. Margaret followed not long after. The handoff was smooth. No drama, no collapse, just continuity. At the small retirement gathering, James spoke briefly. He thanked the staff, the patients, the community, and then, unexpectedly, he thanked Cheryl, by name, for her leadership, for her vision, for seeing what he hadn't. He didn't dwell on it, didn't over-explain. He just said it. And Cheryl felt a soft, distant warmth. Not triumph, closure, which is quieter and lasts longer. As the evening wound down, Thomas stood beside her. "Funny how this turned out," he said. Cheryl smiled. "Yeah, it really is," she replied. There was no need to say more, because the story had already said everything. And now, as we ease toward the end of this long, gentle narrative, there's no lesson to underline aggressively, no moral to announce, just a few soft truths floating in the background. That paths don't have to match to be meaningful, that rejection doesn't always mean failure, that systems matter, but people matter more, and that sometimes the most effective kind of revenge story isn't revenge after all. It's competence, patience, and a life built so solidly that the past can finally rest. So if you're still awake, listening to this drift by, maybe take that with you. You don't need to hurry. You don't need to prove anything tonight. Just keep moving forward, quietly, steadily, like Cheryl did. And we'll let the lights fade here. By now, several years had passed. Enough time that the acquisition was no longer recent. Enough time that people stopped bringing it up unless they were telling the story to someone new, which is how you know something has settled properly. Cheryl's days looked ordinary, which would have surprised her younger self. She woke up early, not dramatically early, just early enough to have quiet, coffee, emails, a review of the day's meetings. Sometimes she paused before opening her calendar just to enjoy the silence, the kind that only comes when your life is no longer in free fall. At Memorial Hospital, she had moved fully into long-term leadership mode. No more emergency restructuring, no more urgent fixes. Now it was about sustainability, planning 5, 10 years ahead, preparing for changes that hadn't arrived yet. It was the kind of work no one clapped for, which suited her fine. She mentored aggressively, quietly identifying people with sharp instincts and calm temperaments. She'd learned the hard way that loud confidence often masked fragility. She preferred steadiness. Her name came up in broader healthcare circles, panels, boards, committees. She accepted some, declined others. Prestige had lost its shine. What mattered was whether the work actually improved outcomes. Richardson Family Medicine continued to run smoothly. The name remained, the legacy survived. But it had changed shape. Thomas eventually became managing physician, not because he was entitled to it, but because he earned it. He balanced clinical work with administrative understanding in a way their parents never had. And he was happier. That was the quiet revelation. James, now fully retired, settled into something resembling contentment. He gardened, read, occasionally lectured when invited. He no longer needed to be the center of professional gravity. Margaret wrote, not a memoir exactly, more a collection of reflections on medicine, on women in healthcare, on how roles evolve whether you like it or not. Cheryl read drafts when asked, offered feedback sparingly. They were not emotionally close, but they were aligned, which was more than Cheryl ever expected. Family gatherings remained small, careful. No one pretended the past hadn't happened, but no one reopened it either. Time had done its quiet work. One evening, after a long day, Cheryl found herself sitting alone in her living room, lights low, city sounds muted. She thought about how different everything felt from what she'd imagined years earlier. She hadn't won. There was no villain defeated, no dramatic reversal that played well in retellings. Instead, there was this, a life that fit, a career that made sense, relationships that didn't require shrinking. She realized something then. The most exhausting part of her early life hadn't been the work. It had been the constant self-justification, the explaining, the defending, the quiet guilt of disappointing people she loved. And now, that was gone. Not because everyone finally agreed with her, but because she no longer needed them to. That realization settled gently, like a heavy coat finally set down. Cheryl slept well that night, which for someone in healthcare leadership is not nothing. Years continued to pass. New challenges emerged. New systems needed updating. New leaders needed guidance. Cheryl stayed curious. She stayed calm. She stayed unremarkable in the best possible way. And sometimes, when she spoke to younger professionals, she shared a small piece of her story. Not the confrontation, not the tension, just the part where choosing the right path felt lonely until it didn't. She never framed it as advice, just experience, because she'd learned something important. People don't need to be told what to do, they need to see that another way exists. Eventually, even the story itself faded away. Cheryl Richardson became less of a narrative and more of a presence, someone who was there, who kept things running, who didn't need applause. And if you were to ask her parents, now older and quieter, what they thought of their daughter, they'd answer carefully. They'd say she was successful, respected, capable. They might even say they were proud, but they would not add conditions, which, in its own restrained way, meant everything. And so the story ends not with a climax, but with equilibrium, with mornings that look like other mornings, with systems that hum, with relationships that breathe, which is the ending most lives actually get. And honestly, it's not a bad one. So if you're still listening, still drifting, let this be the last thing you carry tonight. You don't need a dramatic arc to justify your choices. You don't need to shock anyone into understanding you. You can just build something quietly, live inside it, and let the world catch up when it's ready. That's enough. We'll let it fade out here.